Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon your time zone. Welcome to this month's webinar, last one of 2025. We're going to be talking about how to get out of pilot mode when you're talking about AI initiatives, generative AI. Lots of them fail. And how do you become successful? There's a lot of them that get stuck in pilot mode. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And today we have Heather Eisenbraun, who's our Chief Knowledge Architect, and we have Thomas Blumer, who's going to be co-presenting with me. And let's go ahead and get started. Just a little bit about early information science. So we have been doing this kind of work around information management, information architecture for decades. And a lot of the work that needs to be done to make generative AI successful requires the core architecture, the core information management, the core content and knowledge operations that we have been specializing in for decades. So a lot of companies are new to the and they're realizing that content operations is important. Knowledge operations and knowledge management is important. Information architecture is important. This has been our wheelhouse for many years. And we've been leveraging that for Fortune 1000 companies that are global across the enterprise. Looks like my animation didn't quite work a little bit here, but we're going to talk about the context crisis, why context is so important, and why without context, AI is not going to give you the results that you need. We're going to talk about scaling, why we get stuck in pilot, and how pilots will work very well for 100 or 1,000 documents, but they're not going to work very well for, they're not going to be scalable to 100,000 and more. We're also going to talk about metadata and the metadata sweet spot and how you need to think about progressive enhancement of content. Don't start with an overload of metadata fields. You want to start with the minimum, but then you want to add and you want to leverage AI in tagging content. And then we'll talk about how we can think about scalable AI and how we can improve the ROI and the maturity, ROI of these projects and the maturity of the organization. So one of the things that's really critical here is retrieval augmented generation. And most of you, I imagine, are familiar with retrieval augmented generation. It's basically saying, what do we want to do? We want to use our content as the ground truth for generative AI. So when we are trying to get an answer, we're getting an answer from our data sources, from our content, our curated knowledge, when we need the official answer. And that is going to, at its core, retrieval is search. So we need to have this working effectively, and the same things that enable good search will enable good generative AI. And if you don't have the content, if the content is not well managed, if it's not tagged, if it's not curated, then we're going to have poor results, just as we would with poor search results. And to do this, we need a foundation of information architecture. We call this Information Architecture Directed RAG, IAD RAG. We don't need another acronym in our world, but this really focuses on the emphasis, the emphasis on architecture, on content architecture, on content models. So this is critically important, and this is what will differentiate your initiative from other initiatives. And to give context for our content, we use metadata. And so we'll talk about how metadata provides that context and why that is so important. And of course, the other thing that we're not going to get into in great depth, but we'll talk about it to some degree, is the componentization of content. When you bring content into a vector space, when you ingest it into an AI model using an LLM, it will componentize that content. It will break it up, but it does it in different ways. And you can intentionally componentize your content by structuring it in a way that enables question-answer systems. So we want to be able to be intentional about that. And the componentization is part of content operations and the idea of creating something once and publishing it everywhere. And so these are critical pieces of the RAG equation. So what is RAG? For those of you who are not familiar with it, again, it's retrieval augmented generation. What we're doing the same thing at the front end when we are getting a query. We're using a large language model to understand what the user is trying to accomplish, what it is they're asking, what it is that they want. And then using non-RAG applications, we simply generate that answer based on the large language model's understanding of the world. LLMs ingest all of this content, and they have a model of the world, and they basically answer your question based on that understanding of the world. And they're getting very, very powerful, and they're getting very useful, and they're getting better all the time. But the problem is they are prone to hallucination. They will perhaps expose your IP if you're going to ingest that IP for context. So your knowledge needs to stay safe. It needs to be internal to the organization. Many times you don't have a clear audit trail as to where that answer comes from. And it doesn't necessarily know about your world. It doesn't know your policies, your procedures, your guidelines. It doesn't have your data. It doesn't know your customers. It doesn't know your products. So what we need to do instead, and of course it'll generate a response, but again, it generates that response using its model of the world. Instead, we want to retrieve information from our trusted data source. We want to retrieve it from a knowledge base, from a content source, from a database, operational information. And what that does is it lets us control the output. It lets us protect our IP. We don't want to let our IP out. We don't want to, we compete on our knowledge. And using that knowledge as the ground truth for generative AI is where we get the most value. So this is where it's critical to have that content and have that knowledge curated, tagged, organized, and structured. And that's what we're really going to talk about. That is where the magic happens, right? It's the content curation, it's the content operations. And there's a lot of pieces that we need in order to make that work effectively. So what we're doing is, again, we're using the large language model to contextualize that query, understand that query, and to make the results more conversational. So it's being used at the front and the back. What's in between is our knowledge source, our data source, rather than the large language model itself. So that's what the difference is. That's what RAG is, retrieval augmented generation. So let me, and the other piece of this that's really important is, thinking about the right use cases and where we need a very precise answer. So in some cases, there are, answers that we can get that can have some creativity, that can have some hallucination. It's not that important. A summarization, transcription, creative tasks, those types of things where you're giving it an input, you're getting an output, and if there's some inaccuracies, it's not the end of the world. There are other situations where we have high risk use cases, and these use cases are situations where you cannot have the wrong answer, right? You need that precise result when you're in a regulated industry, when you have very technical procedures and processes, when you have official internal knowledge that needs to be leveraged, when you have time sensitive information, right? When we have to have that precision and that authority. So this is where we get into higher risk use cases where you cannot afford inaccuracy. You can't afford the wrong answer. And you're going to save a lot of time and energy if you can get that right answer. And if you get the wrong answer, you can put the organization at risk, you can put customers at risk, equipment, whatever it is, but you can't get that wrong answer. So let's start with our first poll. Our first poll is, where are you on that journey? You could say, well, I don't even know what RAG is. So what is RAG? It could be your answer. Maybe it's not on the radar. Maybe you're planning. Perhaps you have pilots, or if you have deployed it at scale, great. But let's understand that and give us a none of the above. If it's none of the above, then we'll want to understand where you are. So I see somebody has deployed at scale. That's great. There's a couple of organizations. So that's fantastic. The question then is, how do you deploy that to the entire organization? I'll give you guys a couple more minutes. But there's a few people that need to understand it. Hopefully my explanation was helpful for you to understand what RAG is, but I think you're indicating that the rest of the organization may not have that understanding. And many times organizations are looking at these AI initiatives, and it's not until they fail, it's not until they have problems that they start looking at that content. Let me give you another 20 or 30 seconds. Go ahead and share the results, Carolyn. Okay. So again, a few of you are not familiar with it, and I'll take that as your organization is not familiar. And for some of you, it's not even on the radar. If you have limited pilots, and again, if you have none of the above, just give us what the situation is in the comments or in the Q&A. There should be a Q&A tab, and you can give us that information. So again, most people are in pilots. And the question is, how do you scale? Because pilots will work well when they are, when there's small bodies of content and you can afford to hand curate, lovingly curate, tag, organize, structure that information. And for high risk applications or high value applications, we need to really focus on that content, but then how do we scale it to larger parts of the organization? Okay, let's keep going here. Heather, I'm going to give it to you now to talk about context. And so why don't you give us an overview of what context means?
Sure. So whether it's Google or another search engine or a generative AI platform like ChatGPT, an information retrieval system needs context to respond intelligently to queries and prompts. And the more context it has, the more customized and specific its answer can be. So if we're looking at a real example, there's a simple question: why is my cell phone battery draining so fast? Without context in both the content and the query, I get generic troubleshooting advice like you see here. But if I add context to my query, this is about an iPhone 15 running iOS 26.1. It's a battery issue, and the content has matching context. Suddenly, we can find the exact answer about the iOS 26.1 battery drain issue. The difference here is on the left, you get basic advice. On the right, you get a precise solution because the AI understands the context. That's the difference between a somewhat helpful response and the right response. So as Seth was saying, pilots succeed because they have near perfect conditions, right? They have one source of truth, one content owner, consistent terminology, curation is pretty easy, and success metrics are easy to agree on. And when you try and scale, everything breaks down. You have conflicting sources, content owners doing things all differently, different names for the same concept. Manual curation is impossible, and suddenly success means different things to different people. So the key insight here is GenAI doesn't fail because of tools. It fails because organizations just aren't ready for the complexity that comes with scale.
Yeah, and when you look at what the typical chaos is in an enterprise, you have so many challenges around poor knowledge processes and poor data hygiene, poor content hygiene, poor knowledge hygiene, and a lot of the stuff that we're trying to do with AI is to make up for that, right? And so now we're finding that it's not going to solve all those problems, that we still need to get to the core, and we need to look at our content governance, our knowledge governance, and we need to be able to look at this in a way that is, again, it's scalable. And getting out of these pilots and going to production is very difficult.
Yep. So we need a systematic approach to metadata specifically to add that context. So we've identified 5 critical context dimensions that every piece of content needs. And first, there's the content identity. What is the content? What type is it? What's its authority level? When is it effective? We refer to this as the isness of the content. Second, subject matter. What is it about? What topics does it cover? What domain? What are related concepts? This is the aboutness. Third would be usage context. Who uses this and when? What are prerequisites? What triggers that use of content? Process integration is fourth. Where does it fit in workflows? What are decision points and dependencies? And finally, relationship mapping. How does this content connect to other content? What does it replace or support, or what supports it? So these 5 dimensions give AI the context it needs to make smart retrieval decisions.
And when you think about isness is what is this thing? If I hand you a document, it's a statement of work, it's a proposal, it's a procedure, it's a guideline, it's a policy. And then if I have 1,000 of those in a pile, how do I tell them apart? What's the aboutness? Who is it for? What particular topic? What particular audience? These are the things that give it context, and these are the things that allow us to, again, provide additional signals for the retrieval, because the retrieval needs to have this additional information in order to give you precisely the answer that you need.
So how do you know what you actually need? Well, this is where use cases become critical. A good use case follows a pattern. As an actor, I need an action so that I can reach an objective, right? So if you consider an example like, as an employee, I need to access the policy for remote work in my location so that I can arrange my family schedule. This tells us exactly who needs what, when they need it, and why. Use cases aren't just nice to haves, they're the roadmap for what metadata matters and the backbone of successful GenAI projects. They need to be unambiguous and measurable because they tell us what good looks like.
Yeah, at the end of the day, what's your system going to be able to do, right? This is the thing that is clear. And when we have use cases, and again, use cases are not high level ambiguous. I need to put into place governance. I need to use AI. It's very specific about a very particular task. And again, as Heather says, it has to be unambiguous. It has to be clear. It has to be you can do it or you can't do it, right? There's a true or false to that. And at the end of the day, if we create enough of these use cases, we can identify what the functionality will be. And many organizations will create a handful of use cases. We'll create 100, 200 use cases, because again, they're really specifically telling the system telling us what that system is going to do and what success looks like. At the end of the day, what's it going to functionality do we need to have? The other thing is we need to have a baseline. We need to, in order to have ROI, we need to have baselines. Then we need to say, okay, how are people executing this task today? How long does it take them to create a proposal? How long does it take them to find particular information or to answer a support question? And then after we have this intervention, what is the new state, right? What is the new world going to look like? How long does it take to do something, or how quickly can people get things done? So again, the use cases are critical because they tell the system what good looks like, and it also tells us how we need to identify both the users, the activities, and exactly what content they need in order to achieve those tasks.
Yeah, so let's look at a practical example of that. So let's say we're launching the new flexible work policy and we have a single policy document and it needs to serve multiple audiences. So HR managers need it for compliance, legal risk, and consistent enforcement. Managers and employees need it to make sure they're following and applying the policy fairly or consistently. Employees need it to understand whether they're eligible, how to apply for that working situation, and what it might mean for their day-to-day work life. So the key insight here is that the content needs to be findable and usable by people with completely different mental models and vocabularies and different needs. So this is taking us back to our classic user analysis and making sure that we're delivering the right content for the right people and that they can find it.
Yeah, and understanding those user needs are particular to a role. So again, as Heather is saying, different users will have different needs, and so we need to identify what that means to those different people. And those use cases will vary across those roles, and maybe the content they retrieve will be different. So this is why it's so important to do this.
Yeah, so how do you design metadata that works for everyone? So you could ask yourself these 4 questions. What sections or content types should the policy include? What is the nature of the content? So the isness, in this case, it was a policy that we talked about. How can you distinguish this document from thousands of other policy documents? That's the aboutness. It's about this remote work policy. Which metadata is universal and which is department? So this systematic approach ensures your metadata serves actual user needs and not just a theoretical completeness or a schema that seems ideal. So now let's talk about a fundamental shift in how we organize content. And it's not new, but it could be changed for some of you. But traditional rigid taxonomies, like you see on the left, don't scale in the AI era. If you look at this hierarchy, where would Korean, Italian, fusion ramen carbonara fit? It doesn't fit cleanly anywhere, but with an adaptive content model, we can describe this dish with multiple facets. It can be Korean, Italian, and fusion for the cuisine type. It can be pasta, ramen, and main course for a dish type, stovetop and one pot for cooking method. The benefit is now that this dish is discoverable through multiple paths, just one dish, but infinite discovery possibilities. Now imagine this same challenge with your business content. Where does remote work policy for international contractors and regulated industries belong? It could be HR policies, international policies, contractor policies, compliance documents. In a rigid taxonomy, you're forced to pick one path, right? But anyone looking in a different but still logical place won't find it.
And it's interesting is this has been happening for a very long time in e-commerce. E-commerce, you still have navigational hierarchies, you still have navigational taxonomies, but it's really about classification. And we need to apply the same principles to all of our content. Many organizations are still stuck in folder structures. So we need to think about how do we classify our content across multiple dimensions, because those signals are going to be usable by the AI, by generative AI. Again, the more precisely we can retrieve a piece of information, the more contextualized that information will be for those particular users. So that's why this is critical. And that's why building out these faceted hierarchies, these faceted taxonomies are critical as part of our content architecture and our knowledge architecture. So this is really where the information architecture directed RAG comes in. It's building this structure out for all of our content so that we can retrieve it in multiple ways, and the AI can retrieve it from multiple roles, from multiple tasks, multiple departments, geographies, whatever it might be. But we're providing those signals on the content on each individual object. When we start componentizing content, we need to inherit the content model from the parent document. And then we also need to provide additional context for what those components will be. Again, that's getting a little bit into the weeds, but it's an area that needs to be very clearly defined when we're building out our question answering systems and approaches.
Yeah,
You
and
can
so
kind
Seth,
of
here's
talk
the
about this.
power,
Yeah, go ahead.
of the faceted classification, right, in action, right? So with our Korean Italian fusion ramen carbonara example, different users can discover the same content through their own mental models. The Italian food lover searches for creamy pasta dishes and finds it through Italian creamy and pasta facets. The Korean cuisine fan searches for Korean noodles and discovers it through Korean ramen and umami. The quick cook wants 25-minute dinners and finds it through cook time, dinner in one pot. And this maps directly to the business reality. That remote work policy I mentioned with faceted metadata, HR finds it by searching for work arrangements, and legal discovers it through regulatory compliance. And operations locates it via international policies. So it's the same document, multiple discovery paths, just like our fusion dish. So the key insight here is that faceted classification beats single hierarchy for Gen AI applications every time. It matches how people actually think and search, not how traditional filing systems organize content. And so now that we understand why context and metadata are critical, we can look at what happens when metadata becomes a scaling blocker instead of an enabler. And so I'll pass it over to Thomas, I think.
Thank you, Heather. Yeah, let's talk about metadata become scaling blocker. There are 4 cases we identified. The first one is if you have metadata debt. Think about you are a huge law company and you have not tagged like 60% of your content. So if you don't tag who is the principal lawyer, who was the judge, who is your industry of the client, you can search with a plain text search, but then you see the lawyers when he was referenced, when he was working with someone, but not when he was leading a case. So it's very challenging for AI to find the difference in the content. So the fix of that is prioritize the high valued content, and AI assisted can backfill. So you really want to focus on where it makes the most sense to really have good meta tag, because you can't do everything. The second one is metadata overload. So we have seen that in huge companies where they have like 47 required fields to fill out. And that's very challenging. And what happens? People start tagging. Initially, they will fill out the 47 tags. And then over time, they get tired and start filling things in, and you get bad data in because they just tag what is easy for them to tag. So the fix for that is select the few which are really critical for you, like the 5 to 7 core fields, and make the other ones optional. The third case is meta.
I'll tell a quick story about default values. So again, when you have all these different metadata fields, people, if there's a default value, people will use that default value and just move on. And in one of our projects, we had aardvark as the default value. It was the top of the list. Nothing should ever be tagged with aardvark because it's not appropriate. But when you looked at the amount of content that had that term, you knew that that was an indicator that people were not following metadata procedures. So the aardvark index became an indicator of bad tagging. But that's where, again, you have to think about, I like to say, make the punishment fit the crime, right? You can't make people do all of this stuff and not see the value from it. Pass it back to you, Thomas.
Absolutely. A really good story, Seth. I couldn't agree with you more. Metadata inconsistency. We have seen software companies in a spree buying 10, 15 companies over 10 or actually 2 years. And that creates a huge challenge from a taxonomy or ontology perspective. So there are 15 different ways to tag the same content. So how can you find something? How can AI actually find the relevant information? And here is really like start with controlled vocabularies and auto-suggestion for taxonomy, because this is a huge challenge you need to get your hands around with harmonization of taxonomy, building ontologies, but that's a very common use case. The last thing I want to quickly mention is actually metadata abandonment. So the metadata data is good, but it is maybe too good. Who has not seen HR pumping out new approaches every year, how to identify the skill of your employees or how to have a performance rating for them? And over time, you just start getting tired. It's like, it's not the third time I have to do that in a different way. And people start stopping doing it. So you have the perfect structure, but people stop using it. So here the problem is actually, if the content is not tagged, it can't be found. It doesn't matter how good the structure is. So make the entry as easy as possible. And I think even more important, make sure people understand the value. If people understand the value, they will make sure it gets pushed down in their hierarchy and gets tagged. So the scaling test is pretty easy. Like if you have a new employee and you give them the metadata guidelines, it's like, can you tag 10 documents in 20 minutes? If it takes you 2 hours or 2 minutes, there's something wrong. So that's just a good way to kind of get a grasp at that. And I think now we have the second poll, if I'm not mistaken, coming up.
I was just going to add another bit of context here, and that is that when we train people on doing tagging, we show them the value. We show them exactly where their content is going to show up when they tag it correctly, and we show them where it's not going to be visible when they don't tag it. So if they like their content and they want their content to show up, it has to be tagged, but you're showing them the immediate value of that. And again, with generative AI, it's a little bit more in the background, but you can directly show retrieval accuracy and precision by showing people how their tagging impacts that. Yes, we do have another. So what are the big challenges that you're facing with RAG? Poor content quality? Is it content sprawl? Pick the biggest challenge. So poor content quality, lack of maturity in operations, experiments that have damaged trust, certainly, technical infrastructure. So these, so I'm sure you're going to hit these in one way, shape, or form. You're going to see all of these, but what is the biggest one that you have problems with? So content quality, content sprawl, operations maturity, and so on. I'll give you another moment. But I think it does come down to the content operations maturity, right? Because if you have good content operations, and again, poor content quality is a symptom of that. Let's see. I think most people have answered. Okay, let's go ahead and end the poll and share the results. But again, you can kind of boil it all down to content operations. It's a matter of maturity. So again, and a lot of times people don't have the organization understanding this, so they're not making this a priority. Content quality is certainly a challenge. So again, these are, in some cases, you have technical infrastructure issues, but these are the problems that organizations are facing. And again, it comes back to building the right operations and being able to, you need the right structure, you need the right operations, you do need the right technical capabilities, and so on. All right, so let's keep going here. Okay, so when you think about how you can do this, we want to start off with just the essentials. Like, what are the things that we absolutely have to have? And this is that content model that applies to everybody. So you need to have the core pieces to this. Obviously, and many of these are system generated, right? So, creation date, and author, owner, title, and so on are going to be easy. And then we start needing to add additional suggestions. So this is where we can start having give us human assisted metadata tagging. So it's recommending things. Then we have the ability to start adding other categories and other tags by learning from some of the behaviors. And this is where we can start to look at the content that's most helpful. We can look at our search queries, our search traffic. We can understand what the pain points are. And again, what we're trying to do is build on our core metadata strategy. And then over time, we need to start thinking about maintaining this and improving it. And so a lot of times it's checking the logs of your AI. What are people getting the right answers? You're doing the testing with your use cases and known answers. And then you're looking at things like search logs and inquiry logs to say, do we have the content? Is it satisfying people? We always need to have feedback from humans to be able to do this. So again, initially you're starting with the core metadata, and then you're adding to this and then refining it and starting to build out these capabilities. And the problem is, if you don't have enough metadata, your tools will not find it. If you have too much metadata, content creators won't fill it in. But again, what we want to do auto classification and auto tagging. And that's something we can do. There's a number of different ways of doing this. And AI can certainly help us do it. So when you start thinking about the levels of maturity, again, when you don't have anything in place, and we have a whole maturity model. And by the way, we have a quick start AI assessment that you're going to get a copy of at the end of this, where you can look at a core number of characteristics and rate yourself in terms of where you are in maturity. But again, the less mature you are in these areas, the less capability you'll have. And you need to have greater capability in order to scale your content and to be able to handle more users and more content types and more content, a greater volume of content. And again, there are multiple elements to this. This is just looking at this from an aggregate level, but there are elements of information architecture, of technology capability, of content governance, all of these things, and you'll start to see what some of these other elements are when we look at this. So when we look at the full maturity models, and we have an AI readiness assessment that looks at the enterprise and has 74 different questions about knowledge operations, about technology, about governance, the core capabilities that you need to have maturity in order for this to work effectively. So again, the pilots are successful because we can do these from a manual perspective, but we need to have content operations that allow us to scale and that allow us to do these through high volume content and high volume users. Thomas, I think I'll have you take this over from a
Yeah,
content
thank you,
operations
Seth. So we talk about now the sustainable content operations model. So on the left side, we can go quickly. The key roles for scale is really content strategy, content creation, content enrichment, content governance, and operations, as Seth just mentioned. But so now the more important part is actually really the feedback loop, like from create, enrich, review, publish, monitor, and improve. And if you look at these terms, they may sound familiar to you. If you're familiar with like KCS, knowledge-centric services, it's not new. Like we find stuff, we tag it, we fix it. It's a loop. And the same thing is applicable here as well. You don't want to do it once and then forget about it. Every time it's an opportunity to improve it. And that the same thing is applicable here. And so the critical success factor here is really Gen AI can accelerate content ops, but a human must be in the loop for the quality control. AI can assist there as well, but every time you have an interaction is an opportunity to get a validation on that, or is an opportunity to improve it.
Yeah, every time you touch content, you should add value to it. And again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, well, what is the most important content that we do need higher levels of curation around? Because even if you're doing manual curation and have human loop, it's still going to be done on a sampling basis, right? Until you know that your model is working correctly, that your auto classification is working, your entity extraction, all those things that allow the scaling and the ability to automate many of these tasks will require auditing, right? And we will have to have exception handling. We will need to look at content. Again, the more critical that content, the more we need to do this. And you also have the ability to test this using large language models and using AI tools. So for one of our clients, we've deployed a generative AI retrieval augmented system, and we've enabled the testing with not only the use cases that we've established, but also have used some automated testing approaches. So you can use large language models in order to test your results and to measure the quality of those results.
Yeah, and just talking about what else AI can assist you from an information architecture perspective. So you have the content analysis, as Heather already mentioned, aboutness and the isness, very important. That's where LLMs can help you, but also identifying entities, which is really powerful, and suggest use cases. As Seth mentioned, we can generate far more than you would normally do, and then you can take it from there. But then you also, the other side, you have structural design output. LLMs can help you propose content models, generate metadata schemas, and build taxonomies. Really powerful. Obviously, you don't want to just take that as is. It's a really good starting point, or to kind of double check what you had in mind is like, is that aligned with what I actually was thinking about the metadata the structure should look like? So here we have 3 examples which you can play around with. Is really powerful what these LLMs can do these days. Understanding content, that's the prompt here, building classifications, generating metadata. The important thing is keep in mind that the approach, how you go, matters. There are better ways and not so good ways to do it. Normally, you don't want to have too much stuff asked from the LLM. The more you can break them down in smaller points and you can validate them, the better the quality will be. If you mesh them all together, it seems like it does something, but it's not always what you expect. So the more specific you are, the easier it is for you to validate, and then you go through the pipeline.
So silly me, I forgot to include a slide on our virtual information architect tool. It's called VIA. And what it does is it does this at scale. One of the challenges with many of the LLMs is, you're doing them as a document at a time or a collection of documents. You can use things like Notebook LM, I'm sorry, ML, right?
LM.
LM, it is LM. I always get that mixed up. Notebook LM to upload a body, a corpus of content, and then you can operate on that. And what's interesting is you can ask it for use cases. You can say, what kind of use cases does this content support? What kinds of users does it support? And you can do the same thing with the use case. You say, does this content support these use cases? And what we've done is we built that at scale with a tool that takes our methodologies that we've developed over decades, definitions, because it has to know what a good use case is, it has to know what isness and aboutness are, and it also takes templates that we've built and used and examples. And so we've trained an LLM to do this work, and so it accelerates the ability to not only generate the information architecture, the knowledge architecture, by building the taxonomies and the content models and the ontologies and so on, and the metadata structures. Still needs human in the loop to review those, but then it applies it at scale. So you can do tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of documents and apply that metadata and apply that knowledge architecture. So you're deriving it using the best practices, using the templates, using the examples, using the definitions, and then you're able to apply it to that large body of content. So if anybody's interested in that, we can certainly set up a call to discuss that.
Yeah.
Thomas,
so the hybrid approach still, AI and human curated, there are best practices. Let's use AI for doing the heavy lifting. As we mentioned, it's like there's a really good place for AI, basic extraction, initial classification, bulk tagging, really, really good use cases for AI. Human review at high stakes. If you think about an inventory where you have A, B, and C classified products, you want to focus on the A's when you do the review. That's where you want to spend most of the time. Spot check, don't review everything like in a supply chain, or like in a manufacturer assembly line. You don't check every single item. You have your confidence level, what your sample size needs to be. You check it. If they are good, you can potentially decrease the sample size, or you need to increase it if it's really bad. But you don't want to do everything. You want to start with 5 to 10% of the checks. Closed feedback loop, we have talked about that's really important, where you can feed human corrections back into the AI. So it's not just to find it, but when you find something, how do you reapply that to make the next experience better? That's really important. And measure and adjust. It's all about that. We don't just do it for measurement's sake. We want to adjust. So track accuracy, adoption, findability. And Seth mentioned findability because you don't want to just fine-tune what you find. You also want to fine-tune what you don't find, what should have shown up. I think that's very important. And so the critical success factor here are really make it easy for a human to review the AI suggestion. Don't make it burdensome just because the machine can produce it. So don't ask people to tag stuff from scratch. If you can have a first pass and kind of give them something they can start reviewing, is much easier. And don't show 50 suggestions because ChatGPT or whatever you use, Claude, can do it. Limit it. Select 5 and add a few more optional. I think people will appreciate that. And don't make every field required, like we saw before when we talked about the metadata. Be focused. What's really important for you? Where should we spend time? And the bottom line is, the combination is really powerful because humans are really precise, but it's not scalable. AI is scalable, but not always totally accurate. So if you combine the two, I think you get best of both worlds, and then you're scalable and accurate.
And by the way, I did forget to check the Q&A tab, but we had some people saying they're responsible for the people side of the equation, not necessarily the technology side, so they weren't quite as aware of what they were doing. And other folks were investigating how to implement AI, but they had other projects such as data warehouse and so on. So just wanted to give feedback and say to those folks we acknowledge what they were doing. So thank you for that feedback. And so one of the things that's really important when we're socializing this within the organization is that we need to build a business case, right? And it's an accelerator for AI. And so when you're having conversations with people, it's less about organizing content and translating it into something that is important to that stakeholder, right? So it's not necessarily about taxonomy and metadata and governance, content governance, or saving time. It's really trying to make the AI work, right? It's trying to make it more accurate. It's cross-departmental use cases. It's reducing hallucinations. It's improving retrieval. It's maintaining quality at scale. It's making sure you're getting ROI. So again, CAM will save time, but it's really about getting the ROI from the AI. And that's where those use cases come in to play. But it's starting to tailor that message for people who are not necessarily going to be completely familiar with the technology or with these concepts, right? Because they don't necessarily, content governance doesn't resonate with them, but making sure that they have good quality AI and that it's working effectively is what's important. In many cases, you do need to have different pitches for different stakeholders. And we do have a template for that. It's kind of a Mad Libs fill in the blank, right? So you're going to get a copy of that so that you can tailor your message to the right people. But again, it's speaking to finance in financial terms. It's speaking to leadership in leadership terms. It's speaking to your coworkers in terms that are important to them. But again, one of the things we need to do is we need to tune that pitch to the right audience. So what I wanted to do is leave you with 3 success factors. And the first one is context is about everything. Gen AI, if we don't have the right context, it's expensive, poor functioning search, right? It's not going to work. It's not going to work well. So we have to make that investment in the taxonomy, in the content operations. We have to make an investment in metadata. We need to make sure. And so you need to think about, well, what are you going to do with this, right? And it's looking at the content that you have and understanding whether it's rich enough and whether it's tagged appropriately, whether it's curated for these purposes. Again, what we're trying to do is a progressive enhancement. We don't want to worry about a perfect schema that no one is going to use. And we want to make sure that we can have our AI enhance and learn from the usage. So what's the core metadata that you need to have on all of your content, and then start looking at how you can do entity extraction and auto classification. And again, the governance is so critical to this because AI is going to make mistakes. There's no doubt about it. The governance is going to give us the ability to catch that and make improvements. And this is really about continuous improvement, right? It's not perfection. So what's the feedback mechanism? How are you capturing what users are saying? Do you have mechanisms for auditing your content? Are you sampling it? Are you looking at the accuracy of those results? And so on. So that's really what's important about this. And again, what we're trying to do is build a platform, and it's not going to work. It's not going to grow with the business if it's just a pilot and we don't get out of pilot stage. And organizations that get this right really will have the competitive advantage because so many organizations are experimenting with this, but they're not getting the results because they have not looked at the foundational elements. And again, we want to use the AI appropriately to help us accelerate those efforts. Now, one of the things that we can help you with is, well, first of all, you need to look at your readiness. And we do have a couple of tools for that. We have a quick evaluation checklist that you can take a look at. And then we have a more extensive enterprise level evaluation. Look at where your maturity is weak, right? You'll have to look across these different dimensions to say, where are we having challenges? And then I'll show you an example of that while we're taking questions. And then we can schedule a readiness. We can schedule a conversation and talk about an AI readiness roadmap. With proof of value. When we talk about projects, we talk about proof of value versus proof of concept because it's built with an eye towards scaling, right? With bringing it to production, because the POV says, what is this going to do? How are we going to do this at scale, right? We're not just going to do this as a pilot. We want to do this as a proof of value, not a proof of concept. So part of it is understanding what are those objectives? What are those business objectives that you need to achieve? And how are the current capabilities stacking up? What is your maturity level? Because you can't go from a stage 1 immature to stage 5 in 6 weeks with $50,000. It's not going to work, or 6 months. It takes time to build these areas of capability. So you need to understand what are the current capabilities and what's the current state of maturity. And then there are going to be gaps, right? Across governance, across content, across data, across operations. And what are those gaps? And then you need to identify what are the highest priority use cases? Where are you going to get the biggest bang for the buck? What is measurable? What are you instrumented for? How can you build those baseline metrics? So what processes can you measure a baseline today so that you can then say, okay, once we have an intervention, once we deploy something, then how do we extrapolate and get an ROI? And then you need to, what we do in this is we target content for remediation. So we say, with these use cases, what's the content that supports these use cases? What's the current baseline assessment? And then how do we build out a taxonomy structure, the metadata models, and then remediate or refactor that content? Maybe it needs to be componentized. Oh, that's the other thing that our tool does. It'll componentize that content in different ways. You can build semantic components that really will answer very specific questions. But again, that's driven by your use cases. So we want to remediate the content, we want to tag it, we want to refactor it, and then you can access it through a bot, through a virtual assistant, through search, whatever it might be. But AI-powered search is very, very powerful because you're doing the interpretation of the user's need and their objective, and then you're going out and retrieving that content. And then, of course, you get a cost projection for more extensive deployment. So if this is something you're interested in, we can certainly have a conversation. You can send a note to Joku, and he can schedule a time for that. So with that, let's stop the share and let's see what kind of questions people have. I'll take a look at the Q&A tab. Let's see. So one of the questions is, how do you identify the highest value use cases? And again, this is really critical. So part of it is understanding the needs of those users. So what's the objective? What is the organization trying to accomplish? And then in order to accomplish those objectives, what are the things that people need to do day to day, right? What are those tasks? What are those objectives? And then what's the targeted content that you need to accomplish those tasks? So it's process analysis, right? It's core process analysis. What are the business objectives? And in order to meet those objectives, what are the tasks? What are the things that people need to do day to day? Did you want to add to that, Thomas?
No, I totally agree. I think AI projects are business projects and not technology projects. And then I think you're much closer to a success. We have seen so many technology POC, as you mentioned, Seth, instead of POV, which are driven by a business value. And if you have the business value in mind, the chance to succeed is so much higher just by that shift of mindset.
Let me share with you some dimensions of, and let's see, do we have another question? So go ahead and put any questions into the Q&A tab if you have anything that you'd like to dig into more deeply. Let me share for a moment, let's see, one of our assessments. So again, this is this is looking across multiple dimensions. Let me go ahead and share my screen again. And this is where, you can evaluate, and sometimes you evaluate this maturity across different parts of the organization. So this is looking at knowledge readiness, right? So, and this is, each of these are scored on a scale of 1 to 5. So knowledge readiness, knowledge accessibility, organization, the procedures, the application of that knowledge, workflow integration, lifecycle management, drift monitoring, retrieval performance. You can get a sense of all of these different dimensions. There's 74 dimensions. And essentially, this is giving you a summary of where you are. And you get a score out of this, and then we have remediation steps from this. So this is kind of this is the dashboard that will help you understand where you are. And again, you might measure this in different ways across different departments, because maturity is usually very lumpy, right? There's some parts of the organization that are more mature than other parts of the organization. So you want to do this kind of at a department by department level. And we also have, the thing that you're going to get is you're going to get this quick check analysis, right? The quick check scoring. But that's something that will at least give you some indicator of what needs to happen in the organization. So that's kind of giving you a current state of the organization. And then with that, again, you have the ability to start communicating to your leadership where you have the gaps. And so that's very important. Again, our virtual information architect tool can accelerate this. We found that it's given us a 10x improvement in the ability to derive and apply a knowledge architecture for organizations. So that's incredibly valuable. And when you do these types of projects, you want to have the efficiency of using AI to accelerate those applications and the ability to build this. So with that, I think I'll give you 4 minutes back to your day. Any final comments, Heather or Thomas?
Just one last thing regarding the power of a feedback loop or a loop in general. Just think about if you did inventory like 10, 20 years ago, you did the inventory once a year, and the next day the inventory was out of sync already. Now with newer versions like cycle counting, whenever you take something out of the inventory, you check what's still there. So you have now thousands or millions of data points throughout the year, and you constantly correct it. And if you think about to apply the same approach for your LLM, I think you will have just so much better results. So I just found that a quite interesting metaphor to share.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's very helpful. And I think, again, there's so much potential in this space. There's incredible power to these models. They really, really accelerate the ability to answer questions more quickly, produce output. Every organization competes on their knowledge. Knowledge of customers, knowledge of markets, knowledge of solution, knowledge of the technology. All of those things are competitive advantage. You compete on your knowledge. Getting access to that knowledge, whether it's a customer or an employee, is critical. And what you're doing with these tools is you're speeding up the information metabolism of the organization. You're getting the right information for people in their hands more quickly than you ever have been able to do this before. But in order to do this, you need to go back to these basics, and you need to build those knowledge architectures, those content operations, the governance processes, the feedback mechanisms, the measurements, the baseline metrics, and be able to prove the value to the organization. And using these tools, you can accelerate that better than ever before. We're really excited about this space, and this is something that that organizations need across the board, across the industry. Every organization needs to do this work. So you guys are ahead of the game by at least understanding it. Now you need to go back to your organization and communicate this and get things started, and would be happy to help you on your journey. So with that, I'll now give you 1 minute back to your day.
Sorry about that, guys. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Okay, bye now.
Bye.